Is your team not performing well? Is morale low and turnover high? Are you falling further behind the competition? I'm here to help. I'm your host, Shani, and this is the Leadership Show, where business strategy and culture finally meet, and we make the long-awaited shift from rhetoric to results. I promise I'm not your typical boring leadership consultant, and I will help you get your shift together. Let's do this. Hello, Leadershifters, and welcome to another episode of the Leadership Show with Shani. And as you know, my mission is to help leaders and organizations get their shift together. And today's guest, to me, is one of the ultimate leadershifters that I could be interviewing on this podcast. Let's give a warm welcome to Bruce Daisley.
Thank you for having me. Hello there.
Hello. It's so awesome to have you. And guys and gals, I want to explain why I'm so excited to have Bruce on the show. So up until very recently, Bruce was the VP for EMEA for Twitter, which, as many people know, is one of my very favorite clients. And so Bruce and I had interacted on many of the occasions that I was delivering training and consulting and leadership circle profile to the folks in EMEA and specifically in London. But Bruce recently left Twitter because he has shifted. Even before he left Twitter, he shifted to a podcast host. His podcast being Eat, Sleep, Work, Repeat, and a little birdie tells me it's the #1 business podcast in the UK. And even more recently, Bruce has published a book by the same title, Eat, Sleep, Work, Repeat, 30 Hacks for Bringing Joy to Your Job, which was a #1 Sunday Times bestseller in the UK and has been translated into 14 languages, including American. So we're going to talk about a lot of those shifts and probably some more with you today. So really excited to have you on the show, Bruce. Thanks for being
here. Thank you. Good to chat to you in a sort of non-worky capacity. So it's great to chat to you.
Absolutely. So let's, you know what, the elephant it's not even in the room, the elephant in the world right now is COVID-19. So while I don't want to spend the majority of our time talking about it, because I think the wisdom that you have to share is evergreen, and I don't want to taint it with a COVID-19 like theme, I do think we'd be remiss if we didn't at least touch upon it. And, you know, because it is like the thing that has shifted the world in, at a minimum, a temporary way, and at a maximum, like maybe forever. We don't know.
I think you're exactly right. You know, it's at times it's difficult to imagine returning to normalcy because, you know, so much of everyday normal life has been already upended. So I think it's a perfectly fair thing to open with. You know, from here, I think it's only right that a lot of us are thinking, what on earth comes next, and how do we persist? And I think, you know, it's probably because we are in a shift right now. We're in the shift stage, but no matter how long we take to transition from that, there will be a new normal, and that might be in 3 weeks' time, where we're now comfortable with working on the kitchen table, or we're now comfortable with sitting on the sofa, sort of answering emails, and that's become our job. So, you know, the shift is the moment of, I think, to your regular provocation. You know, the shift is the moment of disruption, and it presents a big opportunity. The critical thing I would say is that it's no doubt, with the economic situation being so perilous, that that some poor performance will be hidden. You know, we'll find ourselves in 3 months' time, 6 months' time, and some businesses will have performed far better than others, because the poor performing businesses will have sat there saying, well, you know, no wonder that the revenue has gone down to 25%. No wonder we've seen the order book empty. And there will be some businesses that have outperformed them. You know, the old truism, the old sort of statement is that you never want to waste a good crisis. And
right.
And I think it will be a really defining point of difference that some companies, and I think specifically some leaders, will find this a moment of real connection with their team. And there'll be other teams
Absolutely.
where actually it'll sink very quickly into a morass of disconnection. The lack of team cohesion will quickly manifest itself. People won't feel connected to their jobs, and rightfully, they'll blame unprecedented circumstances.
Right. You know,
And I
but
think,
just like in any circumstances, you can be in victim mode as an individual, and you can be in overcoming mode. Okay, well, what am I going to do to succeed in spite of it? Like, the rules have changed, but I'll play the new game versus, the folks, and so it's not just individuals who kind of feel in victim mode. It can be entire organizations who stay there and then just are like, oh, poor us, and blame, as opposed to marshaling their staffs and their creativity to create something different, which leads
no
me to
doubt.
ask you the question: if you were still at Twitter with like such a huge geographic swath under your leadership umbrella, and Europe obviously right now is the epicenter, what would you be saying to your team there?
Well, I think more than anything else, it sort of reminds me of big themes that I was really interested in with regards to, I wrote a book, and the book is sort of largely a cookbook of, of recipes, of interventions that any leader, that any team member can stage to try to reconnect their team, to try and improve their team dynamic. And I became really consumed with one piece of team dynamism, the study of how teams work, which was the importance of of human synchronization. Let me give you some examples of it. So there was a study back 100 years ago by a Harvard professor called Floyd Alport, and he
Okay.
discovered that when two workers did work next to each other, even if their work was unrelated to each other, one working harder would actually influence the other one to work harder.
Uh-huh.
Now, one might be working on accounts queries, the other one might be shoveling coal, but one of them putting extra industry in seemed to be, to forgive the word in current context, but it seemed to be contagious. It seems that we
Right.
catch energy from other people around us. And then you start looking more and more into how this might manifest. And so some of the ways that we might see this is that we might see when workers, we observe in athletes, if you put athletes next to each other and you get them to do athletic activity next to each other, they generally, we can measure the pleasure hormones in their body, the endorphins in their body.
Yep.
The endorphins are twice as high amongst people who work next to each other as the people who work alone. So there seems to be something strange about human beings, even introverts amongst us, that
Yep.
we catch energy from other people. Now, obviously, that's one of the things that we might lose in the course of the next 3 or 4 months. And I do hope that on reflection, me saying 4 months there turns out to be wildly pessimistic. But
Right.
we do appear to catch energy from people. So what can any of us do in the absence of having that lever, having that option available? It seems that one of the things that we can do is really sort of reverting a degree to analog communication. So
Mm-hmm.
I was really charmed with one piece of work that looked at couples who'd sustained long distance relationships. And the researchers wanted to understand that sort of strange secret sauce. Why do some couples who live, different cities, why does their relationship survive? But then another couple living in different cities, theirs doesn't. Here's what they discovered. They discovered in a survey of 40,000 couples, they discovered that those who stayed together phoned each other every day to talk about trivial things. Now, we live in an era where a quick Slack message or a Google Hangout ping or a quick SMS feels like an adequate response. Liking and commenting on someone's story feels like it's a great way to stay connected. And it seems that, in fact, there's something in our DNA, there's something in our program which is far more analog, that's far more basic.
Yep.
taking a moment to connect. So here's what I would be saying. So back to your original question, I'd be saying leaders probably who are going to have the most impact on their team right now are going to be the ones who probably overinvest in picking up the phone and having a direct chat. There's something about video calls. Sometimes it works for some of us, sometimes it doesn't. When there's lots of us on a video call, it can feel that we're sort of anonymous, that we're lost in a sea of things. But a leader on a video call needs to be thinking about engaging people, bringing them in, over animating themselves,
Right.
but finding the cadence of what each of your team members wants to do. So it might be that when you're chatting to Justine, she wants a 30-minute call where she's going for a walk, and actually just like that moment of connection. One of my old bosses used to phone me every day, shoot the breeze while he was driving to work. And what it did is it abbreviates, it deletes distance between you. Because when you find yourself talking about what you watched on Netflix last night, when you find yourself discussing his plans to take his kids to the beach for the weekend, you immediately, you sort of delete that distance that we often have when we only communicate in text means. So look, more than anything, I would say that any of us probably right now need to be thinking, how can we overcompensate to bring that? Remember the Floyd Allport research? How can we try and bring some of that human connection that might be lost in 3 or 4 months of electronic communication?
Right, and you're right. It's that informal communication that solidifies the human bond. It's not, the sales meeting or the, all hands meeting. Like those are fun, and those can certainly be culture carrying events, but they're not one-on-one relationship building.
That's exactly right.
The way you're right, picking up the phone and connecting with people are. So I love it.
Yeah, that's right. And that, and that's what the evidence says. The evidence says that we tend to feel more connected to people when we've operated in this analog way. So I think taking pointers for that, certainly while we're going through this really singular period of time, that seems to be one of the critical things.
And folks, this is not a minor recommendation from someone who has spent virtually his entire career in the digital world.
Exactly.
To recommend analog connection.
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly. And I think it's just a good reminder for all of us that just thinking about what we can do to forge connections, and that might be our mum, that might be our family, that might be our siblings. Forging connections seems to be incredibly helpful.
Yep. So let's go, since I alluded to your career, let's go back. You had spent some time on the agency side, right? And then went to Google for.
That's right.
So what was it like going from Google, which even at that point was, a monolithic, multi tens of thousands of employees, to Twitter, which, when you joined, 8 or 9 years ago, was still very much
so.
A company trying to figure out what it was, and with far fewer people. So what was that shift like for you, and what wisdom were you able to bring from Google to help develop the culture at Twitter?
Yeah, you make a fair point. So when I joined Twitter, there were just a few hundred people. So in comparison to Google, which I think when I left there were 80,000 people. There's probably 150,000 people now. So they were very different. I think the first thing was at Google, I set about trying to find something that I could work on that I was responsible for, and it will astonish your audience to know that the thing that I was able to put my hand up and ask to work on, because no one else wanted to work on it, was YouTube. No one at the time, no one wanted to work on YouTube because it accounted for zero revenue, and they were all ambitious and wanted to be associated with the most lucrative things. And a lot of people at the time felt that YouTube would fail, and it
Oh,
was gonna get nowhere. I know.
yeah.
Anyway, it didn't feel that way to me. I adored it, and so I put my hand up and volunteered to work on that. And thankfully, that went remarkably well. It was sort of a good project. It was open ended, and I found a lot of enjoyment in being able to work on that. And in fact, it was the work I was doing there that led Twitter to contact me saying, "Would you like to come to work there?" And I was very fortunate that I was able to really play a part in building the culture of the London office for Twitter, and then subsequently, our offices across Europe and the Middle East, and so critically, it was sort of really helpful for me to try to take some of the instinctive things that I felt and try and bring them to bear on the culture. I think what I've learned subsequently, and why I ended up writing a book, was that I realized that some of the things that we might feel instinctively when it comes to building culture aren't always the right decisions. That, probably I'll give you one perfect example. I remember meeting a business, and they said to me, when we hire new recruits, when we hire new starters, we have something called the van test. And because they were a smoothie manufacturing firm that was delivering smoothies initially in a van themselves, and it often involved, long delivery hauls. And they said, so the test when we hire someone is, could you sit in a van for 3 hours with this person? Now, actually, it sounds fun. It sounds like the van test feels like sort of really nice heuristic that any of us could get our heads round. And yeah, and there's some truth in it. If you or I were stuck on a plane somewhere, we wouldn't necessarily want to find ourselves next to someone intent on talking who was very, very different to us. It's human nature. It's called homophily. We like being around people who are similar to us.
Yeah.
The challenge, of course, when it comes to building a curious and divergent and diverse organization, actually those sort of things like van tests are just about the worst thing that we can do. And so I think, from my point of view, I was honored to be able to build the Twitter culture based on my instincts. But probably the most interesting thing for me was then being able to mark my homework. So as I set about writing this book, and there's probably 100 academic papers that are referenced along the way, and they're playfully hidden behind stories, but there's a lot of evidence. And I think that was the interesting thing for me, witnessing that a lot of us find ourselves as leaders going on instinct and hunch, but more often than not, there is some academic rigor that has been done in those areas. And so I was really curious to delve into it and find it, really.
Yeah. And so did it frustrate you that you knew all the things, both from your instinct and for your research, that would actually make the culture even more productive, yet it's so hard to get people to see that? Like, for example, not being on email late night and weekends, like trying to convince people that that's not good for their longevity and their creativity.
That's right.
Yet, people in EMEA, from my experience of tweets in EMEA, they're answering emails around the clock.
Yeah, well, that was sort of part of working in a company that woke up just as we were finishing our working day. It was an unfortunate consequence of that. The really interesting thing for me is, there's often no shortage of evidence that really sort of can point us in a direction. So, I felt I had one boss in a former job who implemented a Sunday afternoon meeting, and the company was having hard times, and I think this was a way to signal that the company was in a difficult place and we needed to do something radical. And he implemented a 2-hour meeting that sat in Sunday afternoon, and it was really just to try. I mean, it was a slow meeting. It was, I would hope that a meeting, if you were going to have one at that time, maybe there'd be a meeting right now about the virus task force, that you would try and get the meeting done as productively as possible. but there was a meandering pace to this, almost like we were serving our time. It was like there was penance involved in us doing this in as really a sacrificial way as possible. And so, I was really interested. And what you discover is that, let me give you, one of the things that neuroscience is almost emphatic about. That, there's a quote by a guy called Gregory Burns from Emory University. And he says that one of the most concrete thing that neuroscience tells us is when the fear system of the brain is activated, all creative activity is turned off.
Right.
And that's really interesting. So, all of us probably are in a job where we might not be labeled as creative, but we're asked to achieve more this year than we did last year.
For sure.
To achieve more this year than we did last year requires inventiveness, ingenuity, quick thinking. Hang on, I've got an idea. Right. Now, we might be reluctant to say that that's creativity, but it is creativity. It's inventiveness. And so if you discover that, you've got a meeting that's 2 hours on a Sunday and we're serving this penance on it, and that the very consequence of that, the stress that creates, stress and fear in the brain are almost indistinguishable for the brain. And so the fear and the stress that creates is actually preventing all of the team being creative. Then immediately it feels like a self-own. It feels like a sort of a massive mistake that unfortunately is self-defeating. And so that, I think, I found myself in situations where bosses tried to create stressful environments, or in situations where one boss once told me, now's not the time to be seen laughing, right? And so that immediately tells you that when it comes to workplace culture, laughter is really unnecessary, it's wasteful, and we should try and eliminate laughter. And so that goes into your head. And what you discover very quickly is that there's lots of evidence that that's decidedly not the case.
Right.
So I think for me, finding some of the proofs, finding some of the evidence on these things was a really important part of my own journey of understanding.
Yeah. What you say resonates with me a lot, and it's why I love the Leadership Circle profile assessment so much. It distinguishes between reactive behaviors that are always driven by fear and anxiety and are intuitive to humans. They're not wrong. They're actually part of our DNA, but we also have the choice to turn those reactive behaviors into creative outlet, into creative behaviors instead by, just like flipping the mental switch a little bit. But what tends to happen is when people are under stress or in fear of something, right? It can be, fear of not making their sales quota, or fear of losing their job, which, obviously lots of companies have gone through that ebb and flow of the business cycle where that fear has been pervasive. And so they're always in that mode of reactive, and some people comply, some people get protective, some people get controlling, and none of them results in the easiest path to success.
Yeah.
and driving collective productivity and performance. And so so what I love about LCP is that framework, because it is based so much on not just neuroscience, but organizational behavior and psychology and all the related research that goes in to show like why people behave the way they do, and that we are also responsible enough to choose something different when we realize that we've been triggered into that space.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, I think as you say there, so often we can inform our understanding of these things with no shortage of evidence and pointers from these tools that are incredibly powerful for us.
Yeah. And so it's like, how can we in tough times like we're in now, take, the fear and, the impulse to control or micromanage or to fade or, whatever someone's individual fear response is, and turn that into innovation, collaboration, vision, community concern, like, and make lemons or lemonade out of the lemons, or as some of my friends have been saying lately to honor Italy, how do we make limoncello out of the
Nice.
lemons?
But the interesting thing for me, I think the challenge for most businesses is they want everything and everything. And one of the things that I was really interested in is an understanding that human cognition, that human energy is rather more finite than we might give it credit. There's some evidence that if you look at the working week that people put in, that working longer and longer seems actually to produce less.
That's right.
And so what happens is that unless we actually find ourselves being honest about this, we can create a situation where, as bosses, companies, leaders, we give teams more to do. We want everyone to complete this survey. It's going to be 6 hours work. We want everyone to go through this learning, and it's going to be this amount of work. And all of it seems immensely valuable, but we don't instruct them what they should stop doing instead. And
That's
I think,
right.
Yeah. And I think the more we are honest about how work is zero sum, we want you to do this, but we're going to free you up to do this. I think the more
that's a leadership responsibility to reprioritize. When the deck gets shuffled, which cards can you put aside? Absolutely, and that's a failure of leadership to be communicative about what the current priorities are, because it just seems like it adds and adds as opposed to keeping it the same and discarding some of the deliverables.
Very much so. It's one of the things, the fundamental challenges, probably the big differentiators. Look, and everyone who's running a team right now will be going through a decision which will be, if I'm sustaining the same volume of meetings that I was when people were in the office, now that everyone's on Zoom calls or Google Hangouts or Skypes, if I'm sustaining the same volume of meetings, they'll discover very quickly that their teams are exhausted. Why? Because just staring statically at 20 hours of video calls a week is just unproductive and exhausting.
Yeah. And no ability to go to the break room and get some cashews and kombucha.
Exactly. So
I know I miss that. So I'd love to switch gears a little bit and talk about what was your decision-making process for ultimately leaving, a wonderful job at a great company to strike out on your own with the message that is in your book and that you deliver on your podcast, because you obviously have such a passion for it. So it sounds like it was a little bit of a side hustle that you chose at some point to say, you know what, I want this to be it now. How did that happen for you?
Yeah, so for me, I'd had such a fascination with trying to make a workplace that was everyone's favorite job. I was, and by that I mean not necessarily there's an interesting thing, you're probably aware, the idea that you need to stumble into happiness, in the sense that if you believe that by getting a new suit or a new car or going on a certain holiday, it's going to make you happy, what you discover is the happiness that you actually get from those things is less than what you expect it's going to be. But when we find ourselves stumbling to a restaurant that we love, or we find ourselves doing something unexpected, it seems to create a delight. So, that for me, it wasn't trying to create a great workplace that was, that had more perks or benefits than anywhere else. It was, how can I create a workplace that enables people to feel like they're empowered to do their best work, that they feel surrounding is inspiring them to do maybe sort of more risky stuff than they've ever done before. And I was really sort of enchanted with that, fascinated with that. And then I guess, the book came out. It was the best-selling business hardback last year in the UK. I was thrilled with the success of that. Obviously now it's come to the US and it's doing well there. So I was thrilled with those things that had gone so well. And, it became, the question in my head became, well, are you ever going to take the chance, the jump, the leap and
Yep.
maybe try and turn that into something more concrete.
Yeah.
Not necessarily the best year to launch a work culture enterprise
Well,
this
who
year.
knows, right? You know that there's a parable out there that comes from Taoism about an old farmer and his neighbor, and the old farmer has this prize-winning horse, and it gets stolen by thieves, and the neighbor comes over and says, "Oh gosh, I'm so sorry to hear about your horse. It's just so terrible." And the farmer's like, "Who knows what is good and what is bad?" And there's a sequence of things that happen to the farmer. Some are good and some are bad. And the neighbor keeps coming over with either condolences or congratulations. And every time the farmer says, "Who knows what is good and what is bad?" And then the last iteration of it, one of the bad things that had happened was his son had broken his leg. And so the last thing was the army came through their village conscripting all young men for the army, and they didn't take his son because he couldn't walk. And so finally the neighbor doesn't go over to the farmer because he's like, "Oh, now I get it. Who knows what is good
Right.
and what is bad?" So, so
Well,
the
who knows?
jury's out.
Yeah, that's it. Well, to be honest, I've just been focused on promoting the book right now. I've not necessarily set a business up, but yeah, who knows? Who
Yeah.
knows?
And so let's talk about the book for just a second. So you talk about, so it's 30 hacks for bringing joy to your job, and they're divided up into 3 categories, right? Recharging to unplug and getting involved in self-care, syncing to build relationships offline, which is a bit of that the informal interactions that we've already talked about, and creating buzz to encourage a sense of engagement and positive energy that will inspire the team. So from that, are there just a couple of like your favorite of the 30 hacks? Are there a couple favorites you'd like to share right now?
Yeah. For me, I was really taken with, I've mentioned there some of the benefits that we seem to get that when we can energize each other and when we can find ourselves building that. But I think, the thing I was really taken with was the science behind something called psychological safety. And psychological safety has become a sort of bit of a buzzword amongst the buzz phrase amongst those
Yep.
who know these things and study these things. But psychological safety seems to be the secret source of all great high performing teams. So
That's right.
is psychological safety is the ability to speak candidly, the ability to sort of be frank. There have been times in certain of the interactions around coronavirus around the world where it seems like some of the leaders that we've got have been more intent on being praised for what they are doing rather than necessarily hearing uncomfortable truths.
Right.
And normally, whether it's the VW Dieselgate affair, whether it's the Boeing Air Max scandal, whether it's, and probably sort of a litany of corporate disasters through time, almost without exception, when we look back at the ingredients that led to these disasters, there was an absence of straight talk. There was an absence of candor in the way that people were talking. Why? Because the leader had demonstrated that he or she favored those who were just supportive, just went along with it. They just agreed with it. And when we find ourselves without that straight talk, when we find ourselves without that absence of honesty, it generally precedes a decision failure. So, understanding that psychological safety for me was so important because, you might read, there was a wonderful article by Charles Duhigg in the New York Times about 5 years ago, talking about how Google had identified that their best performing teams in the melange of hundreds and thousands of teams across 160,000 workers, they had some teams that seemed to be wonderful, high-performing teams, and others that were performing less well. And so they set some academics to work to try and understand why would some teams perform so well and others less so. And psychological safety was the secret ingredient. So we've then identified that we've worked out what the magic is. But here's the confounding thing about psychological safety is it's incredibly elusive.
Right.
You can't mandate that your team is now psychologically safe because it works on a combination of leaders' behaviors. It works on a combination of things that we emote. If we find ourselves in a situation where we feel that the boss is rewarding people who are just, suck up to him, then very quickly we either adopt that behavior ourselves or we disengage. And so psychological safety can be incredibly difficult. And so, in the book, I recount talking to a member of the British Special Forces. So that's the equivalent of Navy SEALs for the UK. And he explained to me how they set about trying to systematize psychological safety in their organization. Fascinating. And he gave me some tips. One of the things they do at the end of every day's military deployment is they will do a hot debrief. And so this, you've got to imagine that you've got service people literally sweating in the combat khakis that they've worn that day. And very quickly, in the moment, he'll say, I want us to talk about what happened today. Right. So I'm going to describe what I saw. Then I'm going to describe what we did. And then I'm going to describe, firstly, what I did wrong, then what I did right. And then I want us all to go around. And that simple act of the leader modeling their own fallibilities has a remarkable effect because it invites others to be candid. I think, over time, when others aren't coming up with the same degree of candor, it permits others to say, okay, I'm not sure that's how I saw what happened today. And because it separates the person from the problem. Because it means that we no longer are looking at this thing being a collection of blame and responsibility, but more we're sort of looking at the work as a problem that we're solving together. And so if a mistake has been made, it's part of our solution. We made a mistake and collectively we own that. And so, and I give countless other examples, sort of stories, because for me, it was so fascinating to hear this sort of magical soup of ingredients to try and build amazing workplace cultures.
I love that. I talk a lot about psychological safety too, and you're right, it's more of a buzzword and people don't really know how to create it. But the ability to be honest without repercussion is definitely a big part of it. The ability to voice different ideas from, whoever's in charge and have them honored instead of blown off. That is something tangible that people pick up on. People feeling safe to bring their entire self to work, whether that's their sexuality or the way they dress or, their religion or, whatever it is, and that they won't be discriminated against or not given, the same amount of inclusive opportunity that other folks will. Those are all elements of psychological safety that are really important. And I want to take a time out to address all the leadershifters who are listening and watching. Like, give yourself a grade on that. Like, how do you really think you do in creating these circumstances on your team? Because it is the secret sauce, and we do need to figure it out. And in this time of uncertainty, we need to invite the straight talk, or else we will not know what the fuck is happening out there. Right?
That's right. But,
so, if not now, when? Let's create psychological safety, because it's challenging to create it when we're all together. It's probably even more challenging to create it over Zoom and Slack and all that. But you know what?
Yeah.
Now's the time.
But what I'll say is, the challenge for a lot of bosses is it really it goes to the heart of your own fallibilities and vulnerabilities. Because if you create a truly psychologically safe environment, you will find that people tell you things you don't want to hear. and they will provide criticisms you don't want to
Yep.
hear. And how you respond to that will determine whether you've really built a psychologically safe environment. Because if you say, hey guys, it's been a really difficult week, here's what we did, and you're looking for everyone to pat you on the back, if you're sort of saying, how have we done on this coronavirus, and you're expecting the audience to say 10 out of 10, then what you're going to find is you're going to be disappointed, and you're going to find that very quickly you destroy the psychological safety.
That's
And
right.
so it goes to the heart of us thinking you've almost got to disconnect from your own vanities and ego, because if
Yep.
someone tells you, hey, I think actually what we did this week was 4 out of 10, then understanding that what they're doing there is they're giving you something that, although it hurts, the little child inside of you is a really important thing for you to get to a 7, collectively get to an 8, because, and so I think that's the challenge. A lot of us think we just want our team to say, you're the best boss I've ever had.
Yep.
Why? Because in the moment, it makes us feel happy. But very
Right. But in the long run, we're not learning and growing if we are never getting any sort of constructive feedback or differences of opinion. Yeah.
Exactly right. Exactly
Yeah.
right. So these things, you know, the reason why I spent so long trying to see, there's never a secret formula, but it's trying to give some examples. I give an example of when open heart surgery was being introduced, and when open heart surgery was being introduced, the latest version that we use now, it was at one stage about 20 years ago. It was a brand new system. So what previously had happened, to be sort of briefly graphic, but what previously happened was our rib cage was cracked open and spread open, and so it was such a remarkably invasive surgery that the survival rates were perilously low.
Right.
And what happened was a new company, actually a private company, came up with a solution, which was a tiny incision was made in the chest, that the most of the work was done through an artery in your leg, and you know the work was sort of sent up there, but it had and the survival rates were through the roof. It was remarkable, transformative. Here's the challenge: new teams learning it. It was a terrifying piece of technology to apply, and
Sure.
it wasn't helped by the fact that aside from the lead surgeon, aside from the lead practitioner, no one in the operating theatre could see at all what was happening. Now, I describe at length how the best teams navigated that, and what you discover is the best teams are the ones where the lead surgeon, he or she, built a climate of psychological safety. They would say, guys, look, you know, if you can't see what's going on, tell me what questions you've got. Anyone else uncertain here how we're getting on? Should we have a pause? Should we chat about what we think we're learning? They would form breakouts. You know, there was descriptions in the original work by Amy Edmondson of how the best practitioners would be surgeons their door was metaphorically regarded as always open. You know, if a anaesthetist, if a nurse, if a junior doctor felt that they had some concerns, there was a dialogue to have it. And what you discover is that as you go through this, the teams who had these infallible leaders who had clear ideas of the way they wanted to do it, they often found that after doing about 4 or 5 of the operations, they abandoned the procedure. They decided it wasn't for them. It was, you know, it was flawed. This is just nonsense. Why have they asked us to do this? The teams that had the psychological safety, where they often projected vulnerability, where they talked about things that were going wrong, very quickly they got to the level of competency far quicker than anyone anticipated, and they started requesting more difficult patients. They started requesting patients who'd been ruled out, who open heart surgery was too risky for them. And they started working their way down through these cases that were regarded to some extent as inoperable. Now, this is what I love. You know, when we see these examples of psychological safety, what do we get? Firstly, we get these tiny little breadcrumbs on the path, which show us, okay, here's the way to get there. And then we see that actually what you can accomplish is by an order of magnitude, far better than anything that we might normally believe we're capable of.
Absolutely. Well, terrific pearls of wisdom. And I encourage everybody to go out and order this book, Eat, Sleep, Work, Repeat. Where can they get this?
Yeah, well, I mean, look, if you go to my website, it's got links to, your neighborhood bookshop. It's got links to some of the biggest book retailers. So you can find that. You can find it at booksellers big and small. And if you go to, so my website is eatsleepworkrepeat.com, and there's about 100 episodes. So if you are interested in workplace culture, these episodes where we really sort of go into the workplace culture of sports teams, we go into the workplace culture of hospitals, we go into the workplace culture of all manner of different places. So I think you'll find something in that for everyone.
Fabulous. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. It was so much fun to catch up with you and talk about all these topics that we're both so passionate about. And Leadershifters, I just want to remind you of a couple of the key takeaways from today. The first of which is, don't be afraid of analog, right? We might be in the digital age, but sometimes the best way to empower your team is to actually just pick up the phone and have a regular old conversation with them. And so don't discount that, right? Don't discount that at all. And the entire back half of the conversation that we had today about psychological safety, like if you're not convinced yet, read more about it. Listen to this podcast again. Look at the research that Google produced. I believe it's Project Aristotle. There's a Harvard researcher who coined the term psychological safety. Get smart on this concept, because it really is the secret sauce to high-performing teams. And frankly, the only way that I can think of to get through times like we're in now, which are very much VUCA times, volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous, and coronavirus is yet just another example of something that came out of left field to disrupt our normal. And the way to get our teams to shift their mentality and to shift their mindset and to shift the way they're performing is to have a psychologically safe environment. So thank you so much for the emphasis that you were able to place on that with me today, Bruce. It was so much fun to have you on the show.
Great to catch up, and you've witnessed a London sunset as we.
Yes, I noticed that. We started off bright, and now
right.
It's gotten dark. And I guess right now, the difference with spring ahead, because we have and you haven't, or something. We're only 4 hours different than 5, which is the normal, I think.
It's good. I get my New York Times daily podcast an hour early at the moment.
Yeah. So Leadershifters, thank you again for joining us. You know how to reach me. hello@theleadershiftproject.com and on all the various social media. So until next time, mwah.